Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf tet. The shiurim for daf yud and yud aleph are going to go up after class this morning, about an hour after they go up. They should be up online so everyone can listen before Chag if you would like. This week's learning is sponsored by Suri Stern in honor of her mother, Susan Davis. She gave birth to me this week just a few years ago. And to all the women who are learning and teaching Torah Shavuot night in the Beit Midrash for women only, may Mashiach come so that men can gain insight into the Torah they are missing on the other side of the Mechitza. And to Rabbanit Michelle works tirelessly to tear down unnecessary barriers. Chag Sameach. Today's daf is sponsored by Meir and Huva Balavsky in honor of Diana Bloom. For your dedication to learning, may you never stop learning and never stop teaching. Okay, we're going to get started. We ended with this case where we had a slave who brings his own get, which we said, if you remember, it's like women who they get to say, B'fanai naftam, b'fanai naftam. I neglected to mention something important, which I wanted to mention now, which is why with women, we allow the woman to say b'fanai naftam, b'fanai naftam, because we don't want her to get into a situation of being an aguna, right, where she can't get married. So we want to make it easier. So instead of requiring someone to bring it, instead of requiring two people to bring it, right, we even allow her to bring her own get, and we believe her, the b'fanai naftam, b'fanai naftam. Likewise with the slave. Now, why with the slave? So with the slave, there's also an issue of marriage. What is that? So a Canaanite slave, if you remember, is kind of right, not really Jewish, but keeps mitzvot, right? Specifically ones that aren't time-bound. But while he's a slave, he can only marry another slave woman. Like he can't marry a Jewish woman because he's a slave. He doesn't have a status of being a Jew. Once he's freed, he has status of being a Jew, a full-fledged Jew. He basically is like a converted person. So at that point, he can marry a Jewish woman, and he actually can't marry a slave. So when we get him into the status of freedom, it also enables marriage. And if there's lack of clarity, we're going to get to all sorts of cases where we say, ein lo takana, right? The most famous case is chetzio eved, chetzio ben chorin. It's someone who has two masters, one freedom and the other one doesn't. There's famous machlokes Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, and then they come to agree with the other, and they say, we have to free him. We force the other one to free him because otherwise he can't marry anybody. And we don't want to keep a person in a situation, right? Not just the woman who's in aguna, but the slave can become me'ugan, basically an agun. He can be an agun because he can be stuck where he can't marry anybody, and we don't want to keep him in that situation. So we're also lenient with him for that reason as well. Okay, so now we have this situation, and again, we're worried. What are we always worried about? The husband's going to come and say it was a forgery. And if the husband says it was a forgery when it's a slave, the slave will be stuck because we don't know what's true and what's not, and then he can't get married, right? If we're stuck with, we don't know what your status is, we can't clarify it, then they really can't marry at all, and they're no different from a woman. So here you see that there's this sensitivity to any kind of situation like that where someone can't get married. And that's why we're going to see today's going to be all about similarities between get nashim and shikor avadim. So now we have this case where the slave brings his own document, but in the document it says, and there were different versions of what it said, either you and my possessions are given to you, or all of my possessions are given to you, which includes the slave. And then we had that Rava basically says we're going to split between, right, we allow him to be free because a slave is believed to say b'fanai neftam, b'fanai neftam. But when it comes to money, we need kiyum shtara. We need these signatures to be ratified. We're not going to believe that. Came Rav Nachman and said, and remember, Rabbi disagreed. Rabbi was either all yes or all no. First, he thought it all was good, and then Rava said, no, wait, can you say the money is good without, you can't have money change hands without witnesses that are verified, signatures that are verified. So basically he said, okay, well then nothing. He's not free either. But Rava thinks that, and then the Gemara is going to understand this, is what we call palginan diburei. We can split what was said, even though we said all of your property, we can split it into, well, we'll believe him when it comes to the slavery, but we won't accept his testimony when it comes to the money. So Rav Nachman said to Rava, who are you holding like Rabbi Shimon, who says palginan diburei, and we're going to see inside right now where Rabbi Shimon says that. And he's basically going to say, but we know that we hold like Rabbi Meir in this machloket. So let's read again this machloket. At the bottom of Cherem Bet Ditnan, it says in the Mishna, it's a Mishna in Pe'ah, HaKotev kol nechasav la'avdo yatsa ben chorin. If you write all your possessions to your slave, then he goes free. However, because it means you acquire yourself, which is my possession, and you acquire everything else of mine. But if shiur karka kolshehu lo yatsa ben cholin. But if he leaves over, he says, you can have everything of mine except for a little piece of land without specifying what land. And then we don't know what's included in the part that he didn't specify. Well, Rabbi Meir, it doesn't say Rabbi Meir here, but the Tanna we're going to see is Rabbi Meir. And they're going to assume that. The idea is that he really didn't release him. He was just kind of teasing him and saying, you can go free. I'm giving you everything except for this without specifying what this is, which means can't really have anything because we don't really know what this is. And he's leaving over something, which really, it's like kind of like teasing, like, here's your freedom, but I'm not giving it to you. That's how Rabbi Meir understands it. So because he can't gain his own freedom, because he can't gain, the other thing is because he can't gain all the possessions, then he also can't even gain his freedom, which seems like, we'll get to it later, maybe it's not, lo palginan diburei. It's all one thing. It's either all or nothing. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Le'olamu ben cholin, he really is free. Ad shiomar, kol nechasaynu tunim leploni abdi, chutz me'echad mi'rei boshaleh. If he says, except for a little piece of land, so the fact that we can't give him any of the land, right? The idea of Rabbi Meir is, since we can't give him any land, then we already can't fulfill, maybe I want to say it a little better. We already can't fulfill what the master said, because the master said, I'm giving you everything except for a teeny little piece of land, but we can't even give you any land. So we can't even fulfill part of what he said. So we can't fulfill any of what he said. That's what we think right now. And Rabbi Shimon says, what do you mean? If he says, meaning I'm not giving you a teeny little percentage of something of all of my possessions, then we don't know what he left. Theoretically, he could have left over the eved, the slave. If he leaves over the slave, well, then the slave can't acquire himself, and anything the slave acquires goes right to the master, and then it would have worked. But if he was more specific and said land, we can split between land and everything else. So we could say, okay, no land, but yes, everything else, which means you gain your freedom. And if there's other things that were movables, well, you can get them. So Rabbi Shimon seems to say, palginan diburei, we can split. And Rabbi Meir says, no. Okay, so what? Why can't you hold? So if you remember, Rav Nachman started by saying, what? You hold like Rabbi Shimon, who holds palginan diburei, quoted the Mishna where we see that Rabbi Shimon holds that. And then he says, but here's the problem. But Rav Yosef bar Nachman quoted Rav Nachman is saying, even though Rabbi Yossi praised Rabbi Shimon about this statement of his, this Mishna in Peh, halacha ke Rabbi Meir, but we don't paskin like him. We paskin like Rabbi Meir. Where did he praise where did Rabbi Yossi praise Rabbi Shimon about this? Tanya, as it says in the following braita. When he heard this Mishnah, when he heard Rabbi Shimon's opinion, he said, wow, this pasuk I'm going to read to you applies to you, Rabbi Shimon. Sfatayim yishak, I should kiss your lips, meshiv dvarim nochachim, because you said such beautiful words. Okay, it's basically a phrase of saying, wow, what an amazing thing you said. But despite the fact that Rabbi Yossi praised Rabbi Shimon about this, Rav Nachman was quoted by Rav Yosef bar Yomi as paskening like Rabbi Meir. So basically, Rava, how can you hold like Rabbi Meir and say, how can you hold against Rabbi Meir when Rav Nachman held like Rabbi Meir? And you say palginan diburei, and Rabbi Meir said lo palginan diburei. And that's the big question. To which the Gemara counters it with another question. Umi amar Rav Nachman hachi. Did Rav Nachman really say we don't hold palginan diburei like Rabbi Meir? Bahama Rav Yosef bar Yomi, same person, Amar Rav Nachman, who quotes Rav Nachman. Shchiv mera. We're going to learn a bunch of things about a shchiv mera today. Shchiv mera is someone on their deathbed. There's a concept that when someone's on their deathbed, there's a few things we'll learn today, so I'll give you some background. When someone's on their deathbed and they say, I'm giving you this, I'm giving you that, I'm dividing up. I want this son to have this. I want this daughter to have that. I want my friend to have this. And they don't do any sort of kinyan. Okay? If they die, we do exactly what they said, even though there was no real transfer of ownership, there was no document written, nothing. Okay? Why do we do that? Because we're worried that people on their deathbed, we want them to be calm and die in peace. And we don't want to get them worked up. So if we start saying, well, that's only going to work if you start writing out a document, they're, on their deathbed, and maybe there's no one there to write the shtar for them. We don't want them to get worked up. So we say, sure, whatever you say is as if They say diburei shchid meirav, the words of a shchid meirav, a person about to die, kichtuvim ukimesulim dami. It's as if they wrote it and it was given already, like as if there was a kinyan, a transfer of acquisition. So that's the first thing you need to know. The second thing you need to know is if someone's on their deathbed and they say, I'm giving this to this person, this to this, and this to that, okay, they can give it to them right then. But if the person doesn't die and they actually get better, then the gifts all go back because they only meant, right? Imagine someone gives away all their money and then they get better and now they have nothing, right? They only meant it for when if I die. They were sure they were going to die, so they gave it, but in the end they didn't die, so it goes back. So here we have a halacha that Rav Nachman is quoted as saying by Rav Yosef Bar Meir. So he gave all his possessions to his slave, which means, right, that the slave gets his freedom and gets all the possessions then. Once he's free, he can then acquire all the possessions. But then the person got better. Now what happens here? Choser b'nechasim, so all the possessions go back to the original owner, except what doesn't go back? Eino choser be'eved, okay? But he got his freedom already. That doesn't revert back. Choser b'nechasim, why? So why does the money go back to the master? Because not shchid mirahu. And right, we said a gift of a shchid mirav, a person who's about to die, always goes back, right? If they get better. Wasn't really planning to give away all his possessions if he was still going to live. But Eino choser be'eved, sharei yatzar alav shem ben chorin. He was already a free man. You can't revert a person back from being a free man to not a free man. So the slave gets his freedom. So what do you see here? Rav Nachman held the palginan diburei because we split what this person said. This person said, all my possessions go to you. And in the end, he got his freedom, but the money had to go back. So it can't possibly be that Rav Nachman doesn't hold palginan diburei. And how do we explain then that Rav Nachman held like Rabbi Meir? And we're now going to answer our question, which is Rava held palginan diburei because in fact Rav Nachman held palginan diburei. So what's left to figure out is, so why did he hold like Rabbi Meir in that other case, which seemed to be a case of palginan diburei? So again, let's just refresh our memory because we learned a bunch of things already today. What was the case of Rabbi Meir? Someone who wrote all his possessions to his slave, right? We're at the very bottom of Chedam bed, but left over a little bit of land, right? And wasn't clear about what land he left over. So the slave doesn't even get his freedom. Ela amar Rav Ashi, so Rav Ashi explains, Hatam hainu tama mishum delav karut Gittin. In order for the get to be a get shiur, there has to be a complete separation between the master and the slave. And because he left over something, there isn't a complete separation. There's still some connection there. And therefore, there's no complete separation. And because there's no complete separation, he doesn't get his freedom. Okay, first of all, notice it didn't say there, I'm giving you your own self. He said, I'm giving you all my possessions, but all my possessions didn't really mean all my possessions. So then there's this lack of clarity about what all the possessions mean, and there's no complete split between them because it's not clear. He didn't say you are separated, right? You acquire yourself. He just said all my possessions, but we didn't know how to define all my possessions, and that means it's not a clear break. Where do we get that the Eved has to have a clear break? It doesn't say in the Torah anything about it. The word kritut, it doesn't appear there, like it doesn't get. By get, it says sefer kritut. And one of the things we learned about get, I quoted in the Rambam in the very beginning, has to be davar korek beno lebena. Has to be there's a complete separation. If he doesn't completely separate from his wife in terms of the wording, the language of the get, leaves over some connection between them, it's a problem. There has to be complete separation. Right? You think about a breakup between a couple, right? Like you're dating someone and then they sort of break up with you, but sort of not, that's not, you need a complete separation for it to really be a divorce, right? It's always then you're always like, oh, are we together? Are we not together? There has to be a complete break. And now, this is going to come up a lot today, they make a gzera shava between get of a woman and shtar shechur of an eved. There's a section which we'll get to another day. We're not going to deal with it today, but about a shifcha chalufa. It's about a Gentile slave woman. And there the word la appears in the pasuk. And it's talking about her freedom. So they say there that la and la by the get, remember katav la, that's where we got the whole halacha of lishma. We're going to learn all sorts of halachot. Like for example, the halacha of lishma is also learned from get to the emancipation of a slave. Okay, where also that document has to be written lishma. So there's all sorts of things they learn. And one of them is this thing that there has to be complete separation. And this is not, That was why Rabbi Meir said it has nothing to do with palginan diburei or not palginan diburei, that we don't split. So that explained Rava. Rava can still say, if the Eved brings the get and says, his testimony is sufficient for him to be free, which means now he's a Jew, he can go marry a Jewish woman, but it's not sufficient for him to get the property and all the money that the owner promised, because that needs ratification of the witnesses on the document. Okay, now moving on. The Mishna, at the end of our first Mishna, okay, we're finishing finally the first Mishna of Gittin, on Daf Bet. The last thing was, if you bring a get from Israel, you don't need to say b'fanai neftam, b'fanai neftam. And the continuation of that line was, but what if somebody comes and says, this is not a good get? And notice it's plural, orerin. Okay, we're going to talk about this in a minute. What do? We try to verify the signatures. If we can verify the signatures, great. And then we have a good get. So the Gemara wants to know, how many people stood up and said this get is not a good get? And you'll see in a second why they think there's an issue here. If you say it's only one person, even though it says orerin in plural, but it could be orerin in general over the course of many different gets or something, I don't know. But anyway, if it's one person, if I have a document signed, even if I haven't verified the signatures, and someone comes and says, by the way, that's a forged document, Rabbi Yochanan says, nobody listens to that person. He's one person, and we have a signed document. That's irrelevant. So it can't be one. But what's the problem? What if it's two people who came? Two people said this is a forged document. Then what do? We find the two witnesses who were signed on the document, they're verified their signatures, or we find two witnesses who recognize each of the signatures and they verify the signatures. Well, what's the problem there? We have two people saying it's a forged document. We have two people saying it's a good document. Well, this is a classic case, what we usually call edut hakasha. We have contradictory testimony. We have no idea who to believe. We throw everybody out, and we're left with nothing. And in this case, we have to say we don't know if this document's a good document. And that's not what the Mishna says. The Mishna says, bring two witnesses to validate the signatures and you're good to go. But if it's 2 against 2, why should we believe them? So it can't be 1 because it's not even an either or. It can't be 2 because that wouldn't even work, the solution that we said of verifying the signatures. So what must it be? Ella ir de Baal. Now we're going to say, if the husband himself comes, one witness who does an ir or who claims it's a forged document, it doesn't mean anything. But if it's the husband himself, interesting. It doesn't really say why, but we actually believe the husband himself. If the husband comes and says, this document is a forged document, he has more strength than 1, but not as much strength as 2, because 2 prove that it's the perfect solution. We're going to say he's believed to claim because he was there and he could say, what are you talking about? She's not divorced. And it also affects him. He could say, I'm married to this woman. So that's enough to say, we'll check into it. We'll look into the situation. However, if we have 2 witnesses against him, those 2 witnesses will beat him out. And they'll prove that the document is a good document and he was just lying. New Mishnah. Hamivi get mi medinat hayam. Ve'eno yachol omar b'fanai nechtav b'fanai nechtam. We already quoted this on Daf Dalet, I believe it was. Somebody brings a get and doesn't say, he can't say b'fanai nechtav b'fanai nechtam. We don't know yet why, although we do because we read Daf Dalet, and that sugya from here was quoted, copied and pasted there. He can't say b'fanai nechtav b'fanai nechtam, just like the case where we ended the last Mishnah of in Israel where they didn't say it. Right? One is they just didn't because they didn't have to. This is a case where it was brought from abroad, but for some reason he couldn't say it. Same resolution. We try to find someone who recognizes signatures or find the witnesses themselves, and we're good to go. I told you we're going to see all sorts of similarities today between get nashim and shechur avadim. Both the document, a get for a woman, a divorce document, and an emancipation document for a slave, shavu, they're the same for lamolich v'lamevi, for someone who brings a get from Israel to abroad or from abroad to Israel. This goes along with the rabbi's position that we saw in our Mishnah, that it needs to go both directions because of the distance and you don't have witnesses, and it's not only lishma is the issue or not at all lishma is the issue, right? Depending on Rabba or Rava. that you need to say b'fanai nechtam b'fanai nechtam. And then the Mishna finishes, this is one of the ways, and the next few Mishnayot are going to say more ways that they're similar. But we're going to jump the gun on this because the Gemara is already going to bring a braita that says all the different ways they're similar, and we're going to see some debates about it, and we're going to ask, what about other things that should be in there? We want to basically, the rest of today's discussion is going to be about ways in which the emancipation document of a slave is similar to a get of a woman and different from all other shtarot. All sorts of laws that apply only there and not there, or the reverse, okay? Where they're going to be on one side and the rest, other documents are going to be on the other side. So the first one is that you need to say b'fanai nechtam, b'fanai nechtam. We don't do that anywhere else, right? And it's only for get nashim and shapur avadim. And we already discussed today why that is, because both of those cases, right, we want to allow the kiyum shtar to happen in an easier manner. We want to allow one person to say it, to also prevent the husband or the master from saying this is not a good get and then messing them up for future marriage purposes and creating a big doubt about their status to get married. So in both those cases, we need to say it to prevent the husband from, or the master from, trying to claim, oh, this is a forgery, right? We're hoping that if we do this and someone says, he won't bother because he knows already there was some sort of validation process, even though if he did argue, we just said, if he did come and claim it was a forgery, we'd actually listen to him and then we'd have to check the signatures. But as long as he doesn't, right, we're going to basically, I mean, the truth is in the case, right, it's a little more complicated. That was in the case of Israel where they didn't say but right, that would basically preclude him from coming. If they didn't say it, then he'd be able to come very easily and then we'd have to validate the signatures. So now the Gemara first wants to go back to the first part of the Mishnah and say, and here we saw the sugya already. What does it mean he can say b'fanai nechtam, b'fanai nechtam? If you're going to say he can't speak, he's a deaf mute, well, then he couldn't have been the messenger to bring the get at all. Because Tatnan, it says, the only person who can bring a get is someone who has halachic da'at, knowledge, understanding. And these people are considered, right, a minor, or a shoter, or a cheresh. They don't have proper knowledge to be able to bring the get. It has to be brought by someone who we call in halacha gadol, a knowledgeable person, someone who has dat. These people are considered without that. Amar Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef explains, what's the case? He actually was fine. He delivered the get, all was fine. But what happened? Exactly at that moment, again, we said this is a very rare case. Speak, right? He was about to say it, and then all of a sudden became a deaf mute and couldn't. That's what we mean couldn't. So he could the moment he gave it, but he didn't. And then at that point, he couldn't anymore. Now we're going on to the second part of the Mishnah. And as I said, we're going to quote a braita. And the braita brings three cases according to Tanna. Rabbi Meir is going to add a fourth where they're similar. And these are cases, as I said, we're going to see in the upcoming Mishnayot in tomorrow's time. Rabbanan. So the braita says, in three ways, they're similar. What are they? As we said, bring the get and bring it back. You have to say again, either because of Rava, or because of Rabba, but here you'd have to say it's really more the edim issue because it's also lishma, but that would only work for the mevi. The molich would have to be for edim, because in Israel they do know the halacha of lishma. B'chol get sheyesh alav eid kuti pasul. If the document has one of the witnesses signed as a kuti. What's a kuti? A kuti is, we also call shomronim, Samaritans. It's someone in the galut of the Israelite kingdom. The Assyrians displaced people. They took the Israelite kingdom, all the people living there, and moved them out. And they took all the people living in other places and they brought them in. So they took a group of people called the Kutim. They put them in Samaria, which was the capital of the Israelite kingdom. And these lions started coming and attacking them. So they go and they find a Kohen who's going to teach them the law of the land. They realize they must be not keeping the law of the land. There must be some law of the land here. They become sort of Jewish. Big debate about them. And we'll see this in tomorrow's daf about how we treat them. Are they gerei emet? Were they real legitimate converts? Were they gerei arayot? They were just scared into it. And that's not a reason to convert. And therefore we don't treat them as serious converts. even if you go with one or the other, the question is like, how do we treat their halachot that they keep? Are they careful about halachot? They're careful about some halachot, not other halachot. Can we accept them as witnesses on a document? So the halacha here is, a get sheyesh alav egg kuti is pasul. In general, we do not accept their testimony on documents. They're apparently not trustworthy people. When it comes to money, we're worried they're going to lie. But chutz migitei nashim b'shachurei avadim, specifically for get nashim and shachurei avadim, we're going to allow it. Why that is, you're going to have to wait till tomorrow's daf to understand. It's a little bit complicated, so we're not going to just mention it in a second here. It's not so easy to do that, so tomorrow you'll get your answer to that. Next one, moving now to Amud Bet. What if you have a document in a non-Jewish court? Let's say I buy my house and we live in a country where, a document for a house has to go through a Gentile court, and there's even Gentiles signed on it. I don't have Jewish witnesses. The Gentile witnesses are signed on the document, came out of a Gentile court. Shirim, it's all fine and good. Why is that? We'll see this also in tomorrow's daf, but Rashi even tells us here, Dina de Malchuta Dina. We trust the Gentile courts when it comes to monetary issues. What the Gentile court's going to sign forged documents, and everyone's going to say, what kind of a court is this? They have their own reputation on the line. So we can trust it even if the Gentiles are signed. But this is obvious because a get of a woman and a shachur of an eved is not a monetary document, is something that exists in the Gentile courts. But Gentiles are not part of this halacha. Yeah, they have their own divorce rules, but get is a get. It's a unique document. It's not a civil divorce. So when it comes to that, an emancipation of slaves, also the whole emancipation of slaves is not just slavery. This is a unique emancipation that turns the person into a Jew. So these are unique Jewish halachic issues that it makes no sense if a Gentile is signed on them. Rabbi Meir adds a fourth. Notice, by the way, and we're going to get back to this, the beginning of the braita started out in 3 ways and then listed 3. Now Rabbi Meir says even in a fourth, so we're going to have a whole question, why are they all numbering it? What's the point of adding the numbers? Even though it was kind of a stylistic thing in those days. We see lots of Mishnah where they have numbers, but anyway, the Gemara is going to ask, what's the fourth? Ha'omer tein get zel ishti, ushtar shechur zel avdi, ratzah lachzor b'shteihem yachzor, diburei Rabbi Meir. If I say, or a man says, give this get to my wife, or give this emancipation document to my slave, he can change his mind as long as the get hasn't yet gotten to the woman or to the slave. That's what Rabbi Meir says. But the rabbis don't think that because they distinguish between get and an eved. This is based on a concept, and we'll get to this later also, about zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav ve'en chavim la'adam shelo b'fanav. If you give something to someone and it's good for them, and you give it to somebody else, and they don't even know that you're giving it to them, but you give it through someone, if it's good for them, then it's effective immediately because you can do something good for someone even if they're not there. So there's a big debate here. Is it good for the slave to be freed or not good for the slave to be freed? Most people, right? Rabbi Meir holds he says it's actually not, right? It's not good. But the Tanna says it is good because, right, first of all, you're giving him food and all that. But the other opinion is, no. If you want, you could say, I'm not giving you food. You can make your slave work for you and not even give him food. And because of that, it's only good for him to be freed. And if it's good for him to be freed, then it would be effective immediately. For the woman, it's not so good for her to be divorced, even though obviously in certain cases it would be. But financially, it's definitely not as good because the husband's not going to continue to support her, even though she does get mizono for the ketubah, but it's not the same thing. And therefore, it's not good, and it's only going to be effective when it gets to her. So there's a debate about this, whether it's the same for an eved or it's not the same. So now we're going to go to this numbering system. We understand why the rabbi said 3. Why did they say 3? Because they wanted to say not 4, like Rabbi Meir says. Every time we number, the assumption is we're numbering in order to exclude another. Only 3 ways, not 4. But Rabbi Meir, what's he trying to exclude? There's 4, and that's the maximum, right? Nobody seems to be saying there's a 5th. So what's he trying to exclude? So they say, well, he's trying to exclude this other case that we're going to see. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, there's a distinction here between get of a woman on one hand and shechur of an eved on the other. And he wants you to know that in this case, and the truth is even Tanna, that for all these cases, we're looking for get of a woman and a shtar shechur of an eved are on one side, and the rest of the documents are on another. We're now going to see a case where Tanna says they're all the same for this halacha, and Rashbag says there's a split between get of a woman on one hand and everyone else on all other shtarot, including the Eved, on the other. And that's where Rabbi Meir says 4 to exclude this case where the get of a woman and the shtar of an Eved aren't on the same side against everything else. So what's this case? Tanya, we're going to read this braita, we're going to understand it, then the Gemara is going to ask a bit of a question on it, and then we're going to understand it slightly different. Tanya, edim she'ein yodim lachtom. It happened in those days. There were lots of people who didn't know how to write. They didn't know how to sign their name either. So we have witnesses who can't sign their name. What do we do? We etch in, remember they're writing on parchment. So you can etch in the parchment their names. We take someone who can write. They etch in the name, and then they fill it in with ink. Okay, right, like a stencil type of thing. Okay, so we make a kind of stencil on the parchment, and they fill in their name, and that's sufficient. Amar Rashbag, Bamet Varim Amurim. When do we say this? B'gittin nashim. We only allow this with get nashim. Why is this? Again, we're back to the aguna situation. We don't want the women to be an aguna. Here we see we're only putting the women in aguna and not the problem of the eved on the same side as the woman for whatever reason. But this only holds true for a get of a woman, because if you're stuck and you have no witnesses, they don't even know how to sign. So we can do this for them, but only in order to enable a woman to get divorced. Before release of slaves or any other document, if they know how to read and sign, notice reading didn't come up before, only signing, only writing. Now he all of a sudden points out, and the Gemara is going to ask that, where did he all of a sudden come up with the reading thing? We weren't talking about reading, but we'll get to that. If they know how to read and sign, then chotmi. Bim lav, if they don't know how to read or they don't know how to sign their name, they can't write, and chotmi, they can't sign, only for the get of a woman. So now we have our answer. Why did Rabbi Meir say 4? Because he wanted to say 4 and not this case. Because this case, it's not get of a woman and shtar of an eved on one side and everything else on the other. No, it's get versus everything else, or everything is in the same category, whichever opinion you go by. To which the Gemara asks, Kriya man dechar shmei. All of a sudden, Rashbag mentions writing. It's as if he's responding to Tanna, but Tanna never mentioned anything about being literate. He only talked about being able to write, not being able to read. So they're going to say, obviously, Tanna must have mentioned it if he mentions it as well. So there must be words missing, and this is really how you should read the braita. Edim she'ein yodim likot. So the first thing, which we didn't see in the braita, but they're adding now, is that Tanna said, if you don't know how to read and you want to sign this document, it's a big problem. How are you going to sign a document that you can't read? So that's not such a problem. You read it to them, and then they sign. So you can have people who can read, but who can't read, but can write. So they can't read, but they can at least sign their name. By the way, we're going to see later in Gittin, I couldn't help but think about this. There were rabbis who signed their names with symbols, and it could be people who use symbols because they didn't know how to actually write their name, right? Hard to imagine these rabbis who were sitting learning didn't know how to write and read. Maybe they did. Maybe they signed their names in symbols for other reasons. But anyway, remember that when we get to the people signing with symbols, that there were other ways you could sign besides writing your name. But anyway, right now it seems like you had to write your name. So there could be someone who doesn't know how to read. So if you have someone like that, you read the document for them, and then they can sign the document. What if they don't know how to sign? Then you make these indentations and they fill it in. So now, they don't finish up, but what does Rashbag basically say? Now let's read Rashbag. When does that work? That if they don't know how to read or write, you can read for them and they can sign and all that, or you can sign for them. That's only b'gittin nashim. All of this only applies for get nashim. But when it comes to other documents, im yodim likot v'lachtom chotmim. He basically requires not only that you can read, not only that you can sign, but you also have to know how to read. He basically says you can't have, and you can see why someone would say this, right? If someone reads it to you, you actually haven't seen it yourself, so you're signing a document. Who knows if the person's reading it to you? I mean, you would hope that they would read it in the court and the judges would, but who knows? You have to read and you have to write, be able to sign. If you have any issue with one of those, he disagrees on both counts. And that's how they understand the braita. Anyway, it didn't change what we said, which is Rabbi Meir said, the fourth way is like this, but there's no fifth, because in this case, get avadim is not on the same side as get nashim. Vitule, or it could be on the same side, but with everything else, and it's not distinguished from all the others. Now the Gemara asks, and this is the last sugya for today, with two parts to it. Vituleka, are there not more cases? And now we're going to list some other cases where Get Nashim and Shakor Avadim are on one hand, other shtarot are on the other, and it's not listed here. So we're going to have to explain why is it not listed, and we're going to say, oh, well, because it didn't belong on this list for some other reason. V'ha'ika, and we're going to get back now to the person who's on their deathbed. Somebody's on their deathbed and they say, please give this get to my wife because he doesn't want his wife to be in a yivama. Okay, let's say they have no children and he doesn't want the wife to have to do yibum with the brother or chalitza. He wants to spare her. So he says, listen, give this get to my wife. And then he says, shtar shakor zelavdi. Now, normally the avadim get passed on by inheritance, but he wanted to free the slave. So he says, give this emancipation document to my slave, vamet. But they die before the document was given. Well, lo yitnu la'achar mitat. There's no such thing as giving a get after death. He already died. It's too late, right, for this. She ends up being a widow and not, right, who now might have to do yibum if he has no kids. And also the Eved does not go free. He immediately, because the second he dies, if there hasn't been a shtar, he immediately goes and becomes, by inheritance, ends up belonging to the children. And then you can't write a document now at this point from the father. The father doesn't own the slave. Just like the husband isn't married to the wife to divorce her. But if you say, and this we talked about already, give this gift to so-and-so after my death, they will give it after death. So there you see, here's another difference. So they say, no, that's not a difference. Because why? What are we looking for on this list? And this is a very obvious answer. We're comparing shtar shichur, shtar get, okay, those are two documents, to a case of documents, other regular documents. Now, the case you brought was a case where someone said, give a gift. He didn't say anything about a document. But let's try the comparable case in a shtar, and let's see what happens. So it doesn't list things that are the same with a get, a shtar shichur, and all other shtarot. And in fact, this is a case where all other shtarot are just like get nashim and shakor avadim, and you'll see why in a minute. Deshalach Rabin, which made Rabbi Avahu, he sent the following message, and it said like this: Hevei yodim, you should know. Sheshalach Rabbi Elazar legolam mishum Rabbeinu. Okay, basically in his letter he quotes someone else who wrote a letter in the name of our Rabbi Elazar sent in the name of our rabbi. Shchiv Mera, a person on their deathbed. Shamal. Kitvu utnu manele ploni vamet, write a document and give this gift with the document to so-and-so. Okay, let's say I want you to give my house, write a document, a deed of sale or of gift, and gift this to so-and-so. And then they died before it was written. Ein kotvim v'notnim. We don't give it. Why not? Shema lo gamar la'aknoto ele b'shtar ve'ein shtar la'achar mita. Basically, this says you can't give a document after death. So basically, if someone just says, give a gift to so-and-so, it works. But if they say, write it down in a document and give it to them, maybe they only wanted it to be passed down with a document. And if you didn't have the document, then they didn't want it to be without a document. And since you can't write a document after death, therefore, this person never gets the gift. So, this is where more is less, right? The more he said actually makes it less, it's not going to happen. So if you just say give it, we say, okay, that's as if it was given. But if you say write a document and give it, and that's why this doesn't appear on the list, because the document is exactly the same as the document of an eved, the document of a woman, it's all the same. You don't give any documents like that after death. If someone said give this document, so that's why it's on the list, that's a very easy answer. The next one's going to be more complicated. Va'ika lishma, but what about lishma? Why is lishma not in the list? Now you might say, what do you mean? Of course lishma was on the list. What did we say? If for your mevi get, you have to say v'fanei neftam. Why not? Well, lishma. Well, it depends who you are. So, Rabba makes sense. According to Rabba, why not the molich really, but the mevi? A mevi get has to say b'fanei neftam for a woman, for a slave, because it has to be lishma. And you're basically saying, we're not sure it was done lishma. So when we're bringing it, you're saying, I know it was done lishma. So lishma is in the Mishnah if you're Rabba. But if you're Rava and you think that the reason to say b'fanei neftam has nothing to do with lishma, has to do only with witnesses, and la Rava kasha, So why do you list here the get has to be written lishma? And not only that, but according to Rava, even we're going to have another question. The two bein l'Rava, and this is going to be a question whether you're Rava or Rava. This has nothing to do with lishma. Ha'ika mechubal. There's halacha that both of them, again, because we're learning it from get, we learned that v'chatav v'natan. There can't be any separation between the writing or the signing and the giving, which means it can't be written on something that's attached to the ground, because then you have to detach it in between the writing or signing. Okay, debate whether you hold writing or signing, right? But anyway, let's leave that right now. So why don't we have mechubar here? Where a different document, there's no issue with that. But get isha and eved have that specific law. So why are those two issues, lishma, according to Rava, not mentioned in the Mishnah, and why is the issue of mechubar not mentioned in the Mishnah? To which the Gemara answers, Ki katani psula de Rabbanan de oraita lo katani. This list only listed rabbinic issues, not Torah issues. Now we're going to have to see, is that really true? Why is a Gentile court writing a get not a valid thing? Because that's not a get at all. It's not a Torah get if it's written in a Gentile court signed by Gentiles. Makes no sense. So that should be d'oraita, and yet it's listed. You can't say the list is only rabbinic and doesn't include anything d'oraita because of this non-Jew thing. Gentile court and Gentile signatures, that should be a disqualification on a Torah level. Now, why really? Because the signatures are Gentiles and we need signatures on a Torah level. Now, that's only if you are Rabbi Meir, who says the Ede Chatima Karte. Told you we get this to this topic all throughout the Masechet. So the answer very simply, the Ede Masira, it's a get that was written in a Gentile court, signed by Gentiles, but how are we going to validate this? Or theoretically, we could validate it on a Torah level with Ede Masira. We have witnesses who watch the husband give the get to the wife. So what about the signatures? The signatures aren't critical, according to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Elazar, sorry. It's the witnesses who see the action happening. The get is just there as a backup, right? In case we don't have Ede Masira, according to Rabbi Elazar. So we could say that this Mishnah follows Rabbi Elazar, in which case it drops the whole issue to a rabbinic issue. Now they say, how could you say Tanna says like Rabbi Elazar? Because, and we're going to see this in a later Mishnah, we'll see tomorrow's daf, Hamitikatani Seifa, Rabbi Shimon Omer Afeluk Sherim. When it comes to the Gentile core, Rabbi Shimon actually permits this without a problem. Now, why does Rabbi Shimon permit it without a problem? Presumably because he holds like Rabbi Elazar, that Edim Masira Karta. We don't really care about the Chatimot. They could be Gentiles because in the end, it's the Edim that witnessed the get being passed to the woman. And the signatures are just, right, a backup kind of thing. So, because it says Rabbi Shimon Omer Afeluk Sherim, Va'amar Rabbi Zera explained Rabbi Shimon is saying, Rabbi Shimon l'shitato Rabbi Elazar, Damar Edim Masira Karta. So from there, what can we infer? Michlal, the Tanna Savar lo. From there, you can infer that Tanna doesn't think it. What do we assume then, the machlokah between Rabbi Shimon, who says, Erkaot even work, Erkaot of non-Jews, Gentile courts, Gentile signatures, even work for get Nashim and Shekor Avadim. Why is that? Because he holds Edim Masira. Why did Tanna hold no? Because he holds Edim Chatima. In which case, it's a Doraita, it's a Torah issue, and then we're stuck. So we're assuming, since Tanna and Rabbi Shimon disagree, that must be the disagreement. Edim Masira, Edim Chatima, which seems like a good explanation. But the Gemara is going to answer it. I'm going to finish this up because it's really finishing up this topic right now, or at least part of it. No, you can actually explain, and then we're back to resolving the issue. It's really only rabbinic, because even Tanna holds Edim Masira Karte. What's the difference between Tanna and Rabbi Shimon? Why does Rabbi Shimon say Gentile signatures are fine, and Tanna says they're not? Because they're talking about Shemot Muvakim. What are Shemot Muvakim? Names that are clearly Gentile names. Okay, the name that pops into my head, right? Like Christian or Christopher, right? Someone with a name like that is pretty likely Gentile. Okay, you'll see the Gemara later is going to give a list of names that you're not going to recognize, but that in those days were clearly Gentile names. Now, what's the problem? If you hold Edim Masira Karte, and here's going to be the machlokah, you hold Edim Masira Karte, it's really only important. The signatures are there. Why? In case you can't find the Edim that watched the get take place, so we could try to validate the signatures of the witnesses. Now, if you have names that are clearly Gentile names, nobody is going to think that we can use them in the absence of Edim Masira. We'll just have a problem if there's no Edim Masira, right? If we can't find Edim Masira, we'll have a problem because we won't be able to validate the get through the Edim Chatima. right? So let's say the husband comes to complain and we have no, right? So, but according to Rabbi Shimon, right, if they're shemot muvakim, you'll know that you can't use them and there won't be any confusion and therefore it's okay. And according to Tanna, that's not good enough because shemot muvakim, if you allow shemot muvakim, maybe people will allow even shemot that aren't so clear. And then you might have a problem because people might try to validate, rely on this get, say, oh, this witness is signed, not knowing that they're Gentiles. So because of that, basically that's their debate. But then their debate is all within Rabbi Elazar, and really on a Torah level, you don't need Edei Chatima, in which case this drops the issues in the Mishna to rabbinic, which again resolves our problem because our issues were Torah. And they said, why aren't those issues here? Because it's not talking about Torah laws, okay? Where Torah laws, there's other similarities between them, which is mechubar and lishma and all that. So quick review of our daf. We started with this case of all my nechasim, the palginan diburei. We said, how can Rava hold palginan diburei? Now you brought the fanai nechtam. He brought his own shtar shichur, but he doesn't get the money because that needs witnesses. How could you say that if Rav Nachman holds like Rabbi Meir that lo palginan diburei? Well, Rav Nachman doesn't hold like Rabbi Meir, lo palginan diburei. Actually holds like Rabbi Meir, but for a different reason. And we see from somewhere else that Rav Nachman actually does hold palginan diburei. We can split your words, and then Rav is okay. Then we brought up this orim yitzkeim b'chotamab. How many people are orim here that we can say, right, 2 against 2, 1 against, how would it work? Oh, in the end, we say it must be the husband. He's strong enough to do the error, but we can override him by bringing signatures. Then we had the 2 issues in the Mishna. One is if you can say b'fanei nechtam, we do it with the signatures. Then we had to say, what does it mean you can't? And we brought up the case. Then we had these ways that Gittin and Shiur are similar, and we brought a braita that says 3 ways, not just the one in our Mishna, although we will see the next 2 Mishnayot have the same cases. Then we said, why does he say 3? And Rabbi Meir added a 4th. Why does he say 4? 4 was to exclude 5, which we discussed what that was, about the people who can't write and can't sign. And then we said, aren't there more cases? And then we resolved why those cases aren't in this list, each for their own reasons. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a Chag Sameach and a Shabbat Shalom. And the other dapim, the next 2 dapim will go up very shortly on the site and on the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody.